Hello, this is Benjamin Kirstein, erstwhile film critic for various publications and the author of the book Cinephilia. And this is my indie commentary, I suppose you could call it, on Stanley Kubrick's extraordinary The Shining. And it will begin just as the Warner Brothers logo fades in 3, 2, 1. Now, it's always very difficult to comment on the film of someone like Stanley Kubrick, who is so not simply revered, but legendary in the most extraordinary way. I mean, this opening helicopter shot is a perfect example. The greatest helicopter shot of all time. He's regarded as such a master and as such an exceptional filmmaker that it almost seems somewhat blasphemous to comment on his films. But I think he's also one of the most interesting and the most thought-provoking filmmakers who ever lived, and I think it's he almost demands a certain amount of analysis, as the various ridiculous, insane analyses of this film, entirely separate movies, feature films have been made about various conspiracy theories and interpretations of this movie that you almost have to talk about him. This I guess I don't know what you'd call it. This crawl, using the opening credits being a crawl, is very interesting. It's almost never used in films, and certainly never in recent movies. And I think it's sort of another example of Kubrick just wanting to do something different and wanting to do something striking and unusual that would grab the viewer, and maybe also that would keep him interested and avoid the perils of cliche, I suppose you could say, in some ways, which I think he tended to avoid because he himself was bored with them. He himself wasn't interested, and what interested him was disturbing cliche. And this is a genre film. This is a horror movie, but it's a horror movie that also upends all the cliches of the horror movie, and is very unlike any other horror film that's ever been made. I've also heard that the use of the crawl may be based on the short European cut of William Friedkin's film Sorcerer, which uses a similar opening credit sequence. Sorcerer is an extraordinary and very underrated movie. I have never seen the European version, but I think, Kubrick, you can revere him as much as you want, but like all artists, he took and stole and remade and reworked things that other artists had done, and he's not any exception in that regard. So I think it's entirely possible that that was what he did. The use of chapter headings in this film is also very unusual, and I think it does create a lot of tension by the suddenness with which they're used. It's a very powerful effect, and they're often accompanied by a smash cut. And the way that they begin to become smaller and smaller in terms of increments of time, and ultimately coming down to 8 a.m., 2 p.m., and things like this, just hours apart, contributes a great deal to the sort of sustained tension of the film. This is actually the first. It's such a banal scene in some ways, you don't even realize it, but this is the first of the film's great Steadicam shots. The Steadicam was really new when this film was made, and it actually could basically only be operated effectively by its inventor, who was Garrett Brown. And that whole opening sequence, including up to now, is done in one single unbroken shot, and it's very simple. And I think this was one of the first movies of Kubrick's later period where you really start to see a clarity of line that's really extraordinary. It's as if he's broken down the whole aesthetic of filmmaking, the whole style of his movies, to the simplest, clearest possible approach. One of the things being there's a lot of three-point perspective shots in this film, which is probably the simplest type of shot you can do. You just put the camera in front of the thing you're shooting, you know. And those long tracking shots, you know, very often they move, but there's very little sort of fancy camera work. It's always very slowly following the characters, you know, or building up to a specific moment, a specific image. It's very logical. It makes a lot of sense. And, you know, Kubrick was a logical guy, from what I've heard. And it's something you see in directors very late in their work. You see it in Kurosawa's Ron, for example, John Ford and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where there's a simplicity that's achieved through years of experience that's very, very unusual. And I think all of Kubrick's films after The Shining have it. Although there's only, I think, there's only 2 films after The Shining. There's Eyes Wide Shut and Full Metal Jacket, but they all 3 of these films have that kind of clarity of line to them, which I think very much points to a mastery. I mean, people use the term master all the time in regard to directors. I think Kubrick is one of the few to whom it really does apply. The actor here who's playing Ullman, the hotel manager, is actually the first actor to ever portray James Bond. He did it in a television anthology series episode that was based on Casino Royale, which was the first Ian Fleming novel, and they actually portrayed Bond as an American. I've never seen it, and it was a live shoot, and apparently there were technical problems with it, resulting in it never really achieving any sort of wide release, you know, afterwards. But it's very interesting to see him in this role. He's very good in it, actually. He holds his hands in a very interesting way, because he's such a charming sort of character who isn't in any way menacing, and yet at one point he's holding his hands sort of lifted over each other in this almost like vampiric way. It's almost like Dracula or Nosferatu holds his hands. It's very interesting to me, because he is, you know, and he is in an interesting way. Again, it's Kubrick breaking the sort of conventional wisdom of cinema. They always have this myth of Irving the explainer, which is when you should never have some character just explain what's going on, just give exposition. You have to show, quote unquote, not tell. And I think it's very interesting that, and this is something Kubrick did very often, the only purpose that Ullman has here is exposition. He is Irving the explainer. And yet he's very, very interesting, and I think you're fascinated by what he has to say, and all he's doing is just dispensing information. And there's no sense, I think, of boredom involved. There's no sense of that a mistake is being made, and I think it's just Kubrick again, just sort of thinking about this cliche and thinking, well, you know, sort of why show and not tell? Just why not just tell? You know, what's the real problem with it? You know, if it's interesting, what's being said, it's not going to bore the audience. You know, and then it gives you more room to advance the film visually and sonically and dramatically, because then you don't have to waste an entire scene giving information. You just have a character give it in much shorter form. You know, Kubrick used a narrator several times in his films at a time when it had become very unfashionable, and I think that was the reason why. He actually said that in some ways it was tragic with the end of silent movies, that you could no longer just put a title on the screen and explain everything that's going on. And interestingly enough, though it involves a lot of words, I think it has to do with Kubrick being, in some ways, the director of let's say the sound era's most the sound era's director who was closest to the aesthetic of the silent film, and who most echoes the aesthetic of the silent film. All of Kubrick's films really dispense information almost entirely visually. 2001 is the best example of that, but I don't think this film is any exception. The dialogue in the film is really fairly banal throughout almost the entire movie. It's very much understated. And even when Jack Nicholson gets very, very kind of overwrought in his role, you know what I mean, a famously theatrical role, much criticized for being over the top, which I think it is. I think it's also a great performance, but it is over the top. It's intentionally over the top. Even so, I mean, the words that are being spoken are not nearly as important as the images, and I think again it's Kubrick's use of images and the use of editing in all of his films that really tells the story, that really dispenses the information and creates the experience, and I think also the use of faces also to do that. There's several scenes in the film that are told almost in complete silence except for the music, and are just built on faces. Scatman Crothers' scene where he receives the psychic message from Danny Lloyd is probably the most extraordinary of them, where his face just becomes this mask of absolute horror. But it happens with Nicholson as well, and Shelley Duvall, and the way that a face can be a landscape in Kubrick's films, and his use of the close-up is so interesting. Again, this is this classic sort of very straightforward, head-on tracking shot. He's not nothing fancy in it whatsoever, and yet it has this sense of impending menace to it. It's quite extraordinary. Both Shelley Duvall and Danny Lloyd in this film are, I think, absolutely extraordinary. I think Nicholson is extraordinary as well, but I think the two of them, Danny Lloyd, I think, is pretty much universally acclaimed for his role in here. Shelley Duvall, people are very ambivalent about her performance. Some people see her as being very annoying and shrewish and off-putting. I find her very sympathetic, and I think that she's a very honest portrayal of a woman in that situation. Kubrick actually said that he very much changed her character from Stephen King's novel because he felt that, she's presented as being very beautiful and very kind of vivacious in King's book. And again, it's Danny's this famous shot of the blood coming out of the elevators, which has etched itself into the popular culture in an absolutely indelible way. It appears, it's appeared 1,000,000 times in various media. The Simpsons, probably. Most of The Simpsons has ripped off this movie probably more than any other film ever made. But Kubrick changed Shelley Duvall's character from being what he described as almost like a homecoming queen into this much more plain sort of unhappy, kind of shrewish woman, very repressed, because he felt it simply made more sense. She was the type of woman who would stay with an abusive man like Jack Nicholson, and I actually think he was right about that, and it's one of the many improvements that King made that Kubrick made in adapting King's novel, which a lot of King fans were very angry about, and are still angry about. I think every single one of those changes is an improvement, and I think the film is orders of magnitude superior to the book for many reasons that I'll get into. Regarding the blood in the elevators, one of the most fascinating things about Kubrick and his movies is that despite their very self-consciously artistic nature and their very unusual structure and feel, and the fact that they are quite often not very well liked when they first come out, they almost universally, after a few years, completely embed themselves into the popular culture. From Dr. Strangelove right to Eyes Wide Shut. I remember when Eyes Wide Shut came out and was not liked by many people. And then a year after that, I saw a rap video in which the scene being portrayed was the orgy scene from Eyes Wide Shut, without nudity, but the rest of it was entirely the same. There was the Venetian masks and the feathers, the beautiful women in feathers, and the very ornate, mansion where all of this, debauchery was going on, and it was absolutely remarkable to me, and probably had clearly grabbed people who probably had never seen Eyes Wide Shut. Obviously, going back to The Simpsons, I mean, The Simpsons has parodied every Kubrick film ever made over and over and over again. Also Sprach Zarathustra from 2001 shows up everywhere. But interestingly enough, The Shining, more than any other, has done that. And in fact, when I was growing up, the one Kubrick film, I was a cinephile, film nut, very much in love with cinema from at a very early age, 13, 14, and I loved all these movies that my friends had never heard of, and the one movie that I loved that they knew of was The Shining. That was the one Stanley Kubrick movie that everybody knew, and I mean everybody knew it, and they all talked about the same images: the blood coming out of the elevator, the girls in the hallway, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. This film, more than any other, I think, has embedded itself into the popular consciousness, partly because it's a genre film, it's an more accessible film, but also because I think it just has that power, it has that extraordinary visual power. This scene with the psychiatrist, the child psychiatrist, was cut out of the European version, I think, unfortunately, because I think it's a very interesting scene. And the two of them play off each other in a very interesting way, and it's the type of acting you often see in Kubrick movies, where there's an almost total lack of affect, and everyone appears to be sort of trying to be as banal as possible in some ways. That's countered by often very overwrought performances in other scenes, but in this scene, it's there's a quietness, there's a politeness that a lot of people find sort of strange because it seems so undramatic and it's sort of bizarre. I think it's actually very, very true to life. This is in fact how most people talk. They talk around things. They don't try to say outright. I mean, this woman wouldn't say to her, "You realize that your son has been traumatized because your husband broke his arm," and it's the lack of affect actually that brings that out more than anything else. I mean, I remember and people think they see more in it. They actually do. I remember someone saying, reading a summary of the film on some terrible website like Wikipedia or something like that, where it said, that the wife says to the psychiatrist that it broke Danny's arm, and then the psychiatrist looks concerned. And if you watch it, the psychiatrist doesn't look concerned at all. She has no reaction whatsoever, But you read that into it, you know what I mean? Which is what people do in real life. There's a constant reading into social cues and silences and things like that. And I think that's very accurate. And something Kubrick was very interested in, I think. The way that the social mores we have and things like that deceive us, and how those ultimately break down into chaos and violence as they do at the end of this film. Clockwork Orange is probably the most explicit example of that, but I think very much at the end of this movie it's also present. The way, in this case, in microcosm, in the structure of the family, breaks down into, a kind of bestial violence, really. I think again, the mention of alcohol here points to another thing that's very much, I think, an improvement on Stephen King's novel, which is that Stephen King, I have very ambivalent feelings about him, because I respect him on the one hand as someone who can very much, quote unquote, spin a good yarn, and as someone who can write page turners. I mean, he has this great talent for holding the reader's attention. I also think that he's an absolutely terrible writer, and I'm speaking of that purely mostly in terms of aesthetics. His prose is awful, and hurts my teeth reading him sometimes. But the other thing he does is he creates very cliched cardboard sort of uninteresting characters, and in this film, it's very much the character of Jack Torrance is very much a kind of conventional sort of idea of someone he does these things because he's a victim of child abuse, and he's an alcoholic, and all these things like that, and the ghosts of the Overlook simply bring out these vices that are already in him. And there's a series of sort of very conventional sort of middle-class liberal excuses that are given for why he acts the way he does. Kubrick that's present, but Kubrick basically strips all of that out, and I think people say that really bothered King, which is his right to be bothered about it. But I think it's a massive improvement, because the truth is that one of the things that makes this film so powerful is that Kubrick really isn't interested in the origins of evil. Evil exists. Kubrick's interested in the evil itself, and Kubrick is interested how evil. And all horror films essentially are about evil. They're about evil and death, basically, which are our two greatest fears, really. Evil things happening to us, and evil things simply existing. All of Kubrick's sort of later movies, with the exception of Eyes Wide Shut, I think are explorations of evil and of how human evil manifests itself. And I think that in this case he's examining it very much in microcosm, in the context of a family, and of how Nicholson's character essentially descends into a kind of animalistic, bestial state, very much informed, I think, by both Freudian and Jungian psychology. And ultimately Nicholson tries to enact the classic sort of murderous father, destroying the son whose talents and who's the love of his mother also threatens his father, and things like that. And of course the hedge maze obviously is a Jungian symbol, not to get too pretentious about it, but I do think these exist. That Kubrick faked the moon landing, or that this is about the massacre of the Native Americans, I think is absolutely ridiculous. But that there is an element, a strong element of Freudian and Jungian psychology in it, I think is perfectly defensible. Kubrick was interested in both, so Eyes Wide Shut obviously is very much influenced by Freud as well. So so I think Kubrick was really much more interested in evil than he was in the sort of the psychological and emotional discontents of lower middle class Americans. I don't think that was of the slightest interest to him. It's not of the slightest interest to me either. And to me, that's the saving, one of the reasons why this film is such an improvement on the novel. This is one of Kubrick's first great gags, with this zoom in that very few people use today, and that he uses so brilliantly in so many films. Yes, the two girls who have become iconic, based, I think, on a very famous Diane Arbus photograph. Kubrick's wife has denied that, but I think the similarities are too great. It is a terrifying image, and very much in keeping with the uncanny, the idea of the uncanny, the Freudian idea of the uncanny, which is what the uncanny is, what the terrifying is things which seem familiar and which seem to be a place we're at home in, that suddenly become foreign to us, whether it's people or places or whatever. And of course the presence of those two girls who simply should not be there, and I mean even the average viewer, just from the way they're dressed and how alike they look and stuff, they just shouldn't be there, arouses that sense of the uncanny in the viewer in a very effective way. And this is something that builds throughout the movie. I think also throughout the scene where he's showing them through the hotel, this is again also kind of Irving the Explainer scene that's nonetheless very interesting. Partly because the sets are so extraordinary. Amazing production design, based on several hotels, I think. A series of different sort of patchwork of various hotel interior designs of various hotels in America. And I think also the portrayal, you start to get a real sense of the family's dysfunction, I think, in these scenes, in the way that the husband and wife interact, which is a very subtle sort of sense, because the way that they talk to each other is very much, they're sort of making bad jokes and saying banal things to each other, and it all seems sort of quite normal. In reality, that's what dysfunctional families do, is that they put an enormous amount of effort into seeming normal. And what they do is they tell bad jokes that everyone's heard before, and they speak in cliches, and they smile all the time and all the rest of it. And but there's a strain to it, and that you see in this film, in this couple, that I think is very, very telling. And of course, this walk also in these classic long reverse tracking shots, or in this case, reverse Steadicam shots that Kubrick loves. Again, very simple 3-point shots. It also, in essence, shows all the guns that are going to go off in the third act or whatever, because this is the gold room where the ghosts first appear, and then you see the snowcat, which she wants to escape in, and that he sabotages, and then you meet the cook who becomes Danny's. You see the two little girls. It's pretty much everything that's going to happen in the movie. You see the elevators, everything in the movie that's going to happen and be horrifying is shown to you in its normal form in this sequence. The production design is also very interesting because it completely, as I said, upends the cliches of the horror movie. This is essentially a haunted house story when you get right down to it. And I think what Kubrick extracted from King's novel was what he was attracted to in King's novel was that essential idea of basically a modern haunted house story. What's interesting about it is that the whole production design is completely the opposite of what a haunted house story normally involves, which is a kind of dark spiderweb laden gothic castle on top of a hill. The rest of it, now this is on top of a hill, but but it's never it's large, it's brightly lit, you can see into all the corners, it's hyper modern in some ways. It has all these shiny surfaces, and there doesn't seem to be anything hidden. There's no shadows or blind, dark places for things to hide in, It very much upends all the cliches of the haunted house film, if you like, and in a way also that's very interesting because I think what Kubrick maybe realized is what's terrifying about a haunted house is not that it's sort of dark and makes weird noises, but that it's a labyrinth essentially. It's a maze, and in the sort of the way that Jorge Luis Borges used labyrinths, and Jung used labyrinths as essentially metaphors for the human psyche, and obviously the hedge maze is a very explicit vision of that. But the hotel itself is also a labyrinth, and the whole concept of the labyrinth as a metaphor for the psyche is that you are going in on this very strange, unknowable journey with many twists and turns, and in the center of which you will eventually find the monster. The Minotaur, essentially, and if you defeat the Minotaur, then you emerge the hero. It's a sort of classic, going back to obviously Perseus and the Minotaur and the labyrinth of Crete and all the rest of it. And that climax also is very much echoed in the final scene, the sort of chase, the duel, really, between Jack Torrance and his son, where Jack reverts essentially to an animalistic state and becomes the Minotaur in the center of the labyrinth, and ultimately his son heroically defeats him. In this case, interestingly, by outsmarting him and not by outfighting him, which I think says something about Kubrick and Kubrick's ultimate belief in the intelligence, in the power of the mind to at least in some way overcome the bestial within us, which is not something people tend to give him credit for. They tend to see him as being very pessimistic on the issue of man's bestial nature, but I don't think that's true personally. But Kubrick is a filmmaker, perhaps partly through his own fault and his cultivation of ambiguity, who is destined to be misinterpreted for all time. I have to say, Scatman Carruthers, what is by far and away his greatest performance. He was mostly stuck in B movies, I think, for the most part of his career. He's absolutely marvelous in this, and the conversation between him and Danny, where they discuss his extraordinary talent, is really, I think, a wonderful, wonderful piece of acting, and especially in that Halloran is really the most human character in the film, and Carruthers, I think, really gets that apart. He has a kind of life that the other characters don't have, and a comfort with himself, maybe because he's made peace with his talent, with this unusual Shining, the Shining that he possesses, these psychic powers that he possesses. And he also treats Danny as an equal, which I think is very, very touching. Because Danny is so clearly a kind of model of the gifted child, a child who's both very immature, but very developed psychologically and intellectually, well beyond his chronological age. And Halloran is really the only character in the film who understands that and who has compassion for that. And I think that people accuse Kubrick of being very cold, which is something that I frankly don't think is particularly relevant to anything. I mean, if he were cold, it makes no difference. I mean, if a movie is cold and detached, it can still be a great movie. It's got nothing to do with whether it's a good film or not, or whether someone is a good filmmaker or not. But I think Halloran and Danny's character in The Shining really do disprove that. They're very sympathetic and compassionate characters, and very human. And I don't see the kind of misanthropy that people see, that people note all the time in Kubrick. The situation is horrible. Kubrick often portrays situations as being extremely horrible and inhuman and evil in a detached way, but I simply don't. I don't agree with the idea that he's unsparing or pitiless or merciless in his portrayal of certain characters, or in his portrayal of human beings. Not entirely, certainly. This is also an interesting example of the unusual way that Kubrick in his later career began to cut dialogue scenes, which is that he allows for very long pauses between the characters' lines, and it's a very slow cutting in a way that's very unusual. Your average Hollywood film would cut much faster between dialogue, and I think it creates room for the viewer to sort of fall into it themselves. There's something hypnotic in the rhythms that it creates, that I personally find very attractive. It's part again of the way that you sink into a Kubrick film, and it's a cliche, but it really is true. You see a different film every time. There's a depth of it sounds pretentious, but there's a depth of meaning in his films that has to be slowly peeled away and uncovered, and his films reinvent themselves every time you see them. And for example, I actually, it wasn't until I read an article about the film that I realized that knife rack is right above Danny Lloyd in this scene, which is pretty clearly intentional, And you always sort of notice something else, and I think that the way that he, even just the way he cuts a very basic dialogue scene, is done in a way that Kubrick wanted to be unusual. He didn't want to. Again, just probably from just being bored, just from wanting to interest himself, maybe, in how can you do this a little differently? How can you do this in a way that will be a slight disturbance, which is the essence of art in some ways. I think art is, to my mind, the disturbance of ritual, the slight derangement of ritual, because ritual obviously is an aesthetic experience in some way, and art to me is the slight derangement of that aesthetic experience, and where it pushes away from that and it becomes something slightly dangerous, something that disturbs the order of things, and I think Kubrick was after that all of his life, of distressing the ritual of cinema and the way that movies are made, the way that movies are cut, and not in a kind of mindless way, not in the way that certain avant-garde films, it's very easy to do something different. You just sort of, throw shit together and hope for the best, you know what I mean? And probably something different will come out, but it's not very interesting, and it doesn't really have any relevance, because you haven't engaged with what you're trying to change, and I think that Kubrick was never mindless in that sense. He was always very careful and very subtle, and I think it makes it much more powerful in an interesting way. These are all second unit shots of I think it was called the Timberline Lodge somewhere in Colorado. There's another one of the long steady cam. So it's very interesting. I think almost all of the moving shots, not all of them maybe, but I think an enormous amount of the moving shots in this film are steady cam shots, and I believe this is one of them. The beauty of the Steadicam obviously is well, it's perfect for a guy like Kubrick who loved long moving shots. This is obviously another the iconic images. No one seems to know exactly what he's riding here. It's called a Hot Wheels, and I had several of them when I was a little kid. And they're these kind of bizarre plastic sort of pseudo tricycles that you low to the ground that you could ride around on the street and the sidewalk. And they were a lot of fun. I remember this. When I was about this age, I had one of them. Very much of a piece with the era in which this film is made. And interestingly enough, maybe a testament to Kubrick's attention to detail, where he sort of said, well, what would a kid that age in that part of America, be riding on through the halls of a hotel, and did a little research and figured out, well, Hot Wheels is the most likely thing, This is a very interesting scene to me. Because the way that Kubrick uses the mirror, again, a scene that seems to be entirely banal and really just expositional at the most expositional, and maybe even a little unnecessary. But what Kubrick's doing is by shooting into the mirror, and also by breaking the line, the classic sort of 180-degree line that editors respect so consistently. He gives it a really interesting, unsettling quality. The 180-degree line is the idea that there's like if you have two characters, then you have if you imagine a kind of a circular circumference around them, that when you shoot them, you will shoot them entirely from one side of that circle. So if you start off shooting the characters from the right, all the shots that you edit together will be from that same side of that 180-degree line dividing the circle. In this film, several times Kubrick crosses that to the other side of the circle and shoots them from the other side, and creates the most famous example is in the red and white tiled bathroom where he meets the ghostly caretaker. Extraordinary scene. What it does is create a very unsettling, disorienting effect that I find really interesting, and there's a little bit of it there. In fact, he's sort of playing with how far you can go across the 180 degrees, and then he right there, yeah, and then here you have this total change of perspective, you don't even notice it at first, but it gives you a slight sensation of, well, wait a minute, things are sort of. And then he starts to tell this story about how he has this joke about how he's been there before, which is obviously kind of blatant piece of foreshadowing. Here's a famous typewriter on which the legendary words "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy" will be written. Very notably in the documentary on Kubrick's life, Nicholson said that he came up with this idea of throwing the tennis ball. The script just said Jack is not writing, so the question then arose of, well, what is he doing? So Nicholson said, well, this is the type of thing I do when I'm alone. So, and now we make the first entrance into this extraordinary hedge maze. An absolutely stroke of genius on the part of Kubrick and his co-writer Diane Johnson. It just brings up so much of the primordial emotion that surrounds the horror tale, and every horror tale, to my mind, is a trip down into the recesses of the human mind, a cathartic confrontation with all those things that we hide from ourselves and prefer not to think about. What Jung called the shadow, your shadow self, your other side, your double, all the things that we suppress or which remain in our unconscious, and perhaps in some ways it's better that they stay there. But at the same time we do have to have some relationship with them, because otherwise it'll drive us nuts to suppress them all the time. So obviously we have things like the horror tale to confront it in a cathartic way, in a way that we can make friends with them, if you like. And I think Anthony Hopkins, said that describing Jung's career, Jung's theories, he said the idea is if you can make friends with the shadow, that life becomes richer. And I think there's some of that. I think this is a special effects shot. One of the few, I think, in the film. There's many practical effects in the film, but I think one of the few process shots. I'm not sure exactly how it was done, but it's flawless. It's absolutely flawless, as most of the special effects always are in Kubrick's films. You never notice it, and that is obsessive attention to detail. There's people go on and on about how crazy Kubrick was, how compulsive he was, but you see stuff like that. There was certainly a method in the madness, and the method may have gone mad at certain points, but I think the method was clear throughout, which is to get it as right as humanly possible, and to not make the mistakes or cut the corners that other people often do, because that's how you make a great film. Unfortunately, people like Shelley Duvall suffered as a result. That's I don't know how much it's worth it really to talk about that. That's become an infamous thing. The fact that he supposedly emotionally abused Shelley Duvall and then gave her a horrible, miserable experience while she was shooting this. I think some of that's I'm sure that his method did probably drive her nuts and was very painful for her, and he did. People have said that some of it he did deliberately, and that it was to make her more into that character, because she had to be crazy and hysterical through the whole thing. I can't remember if this is where the girls appear or not. I don't remember. I think it is. Yeah, I think when he makes this. No, maybe. Even I'm fraught with anticipation. But it's remarkable how Kubrick takes his time, No, it's the room, of course. Kubrick takes his time and lets these things play out. And Ridley Scott actually said something about Alien, which is that silence and slowness are often thought to be verboten in thrillers or in horror films, but in actuality, and Hitchcock also knew this very well. It's actually silence and slowness that creates the fear, that creates the suspense, because your own terrors, your own fears flow into that empty space that's created by that silence and that slowness. And in an odd way, Scott said that silence lets you know that something's going to happen, in a film. So when things are quiet, And in an odd way, also, this moment here is a red herring, because the door's locked, he doesn't get in. So there's a kind of, it doesn't quite pay off yet, but it's again that process of slowly building the tension. Yeah, and there they are. I love the way that Kubrick portrays Danny's psychic vision so simply. Again, it's that simplicity that he's reached at this point in his career. He just uses straight cuts, very short flash cuts, or jump cuts, to the vision that he's having, and it's hugely effective. And most people would use, I don't know, a fade out or a big, and often it's done without a cue, without any sort of big sound cue or anything like that. Sometimes it is, but other times it isn't. And it's an example of how effective simple editing can be. What an extraordinary special effect just cutting can be. Just cutting a film can be. And I think that's very much a kinship again with silent cinema. I think this is just a very disturbing scene. How he attacks her so brutally, emotionally speaking, and she just takes it. Which I think is one of the reasons why Again, a lot of people disliked Shelley Duvall's character. Why doesn't she argue back? Why doesn't she fight back? Well, she stayed with him this long. you know, so women in abusive relationships, even if just emotionally abusive relationships, codependent relationships, whatever the clinical or popular clinical term for it is now, that's what they do. They take it. I think it's very honest. And honest things are often the things we least want to see. So, as Kubrick's career has proved over and over and over again, the endless explosions of critical rage and incomprehension and violence against his films, I think, is so much on the basis of that. Most critics are essentially liars. They talk about wanting to see something different and unique, and then when they do, they absolutely loathe and hate it and are even offended by it. Mainly because I think most movie critics are incompetent. They don't really know anything about movies, and they don't particularly care about movies. They don't particularly like movies, to be fully honest. I think certainly most American film critics are not, would regard cinema as being a lower form of art and would prefer to be reviewing novels or I don't know, dance or symphonies or I don't know, something more respectable and highbrow, And quite often they're just, the person who nobody could figure out what to do with them, and so they gave them a job reviewing movies. Very few of them have any training, The only American critic I have any respect for is Armand White, who's a wonderful New York film critic, brilliant, and constantly thinking about film and constantly coming up with extraordinary new ways of looking at movies, old and new, and there's a reason why he's so hated by the rest of the critical establishment, And Kubrick is a classic example of that. The critics, by and large, either hated or were very ambivalent about every one of his films before they came out. When they came out, and then a little bit of time passes, 5 years, 10 years, and all of a sudden they're talking about them as if these were immortal classics that they loved right from the beginning. So there's probably been more critical lying in terms of critics lying about themselves in regard to Stanley Kubrick than any other filmmaker. Here's one of Kubrick's classic stares. The lowered head staring up at the camera. You know what I mean? There's several of them in this film, and Nicholson is very good at it, probably because of those remarkable eyebrows he has, those incredibly arched eyebrows. Works brilliantly well. And here, I mean, you do. One of the things that Stephen King complained about is that Jack Nicholson seems crazy from the beginning, and he appears to go mad too fast. Okay, I mean, I don't know what too fast means in terms of going crazy. I think, again, it's just a question of, Kubrick isn't interested in the descent into madness. He isn't interested in the reasons why someone goes crazy. He's interested in the madness itself. How does it come about? What is the thing? What is it in and of itself? You know what I mean? What is human insanity? What is human bestiality? What is human savagery? So naturally, that's what he's going to concentrate on. A normal guy is not interesting. A normal guy descending into madness is not interesting because you don't descend into madness. The madness is in all of us. We all have our insane side. We all have our bestial side, our violent side, our aggressive side. And so the question obviously is simply. What Kubrick, I think, is interested in is almost a kind of an analysis, an untangling of the nature of that madness, rather than I don't know, the sort of emotional pathos of the person themselves, because it could be any of us, really. I love this scene, this conversation, because again, it really, I think Shelley Duvall's character really is very, very sympathetic. I don't see her as being pathetic or contemptible at all. I think, because in this scene here, so the way she drags out this conversation, making these sort of banal statements, it's so clear that she's just desperate to talk to somebody. She's already been stuck in this place with this, really pretty horrible guy, and a son who's obviously troubled, and and they're about to be completely snowed in, and she's just desperate for some sort of outside human contact. And I really think she's a very sympathetic character, and portrayed with a lot of compassion. I don't see the kind of sadism in her portrayal that other people see. I don't see the kind of I don't know, mousiness or that sort of thing. I think this might be one of the examples of how the Overlook Hotel doesn't make sense, which is that he seems to be going from the kitchen, into a carpeted hallway, which shouldn't really be happening. But yeah, here they are. Yes, the Arbus girls. This is the scene that everybody mentions. You say The Shining, they say the girls in the hallway, or they say the blood in the elevator, but it's almost always the girls in the hallway. And again, just such a simple 3-point shot looking at the girls, and then just a straight-on face, full face close-up looking at the boy. There's no... Danny Lloyd's, his face is so marvelous in this. I mean, yeah. And then those the jump cut flashes. You barely see it, but it registers so powerfully because of the cut, because of the impact of the cut is so sudden. Again, it's extraordinary, editing as the ultimate special effect, the best special effect there is. You don't really need that much, I think, is what Kubrick realized. And it was also there in the way that people talk about how he pared down his crew to just the absolute bare essentials. He had 20, 25 people working in his crew as opposed to hundreds, their Hollywood productions. And he it was the point that you don't really need that much. You can pare it down, and people become... And artists become very wrapped up in needing so many things, and Kubrick, over the course of his life, it seemed his career, he sort of pared it away bit by bit until he came down to just what the essence of cinema was. So and I see Kubrick as being a kind of essential cinema, especially in his later career. He really stands alone. He used the term unique, but I think it was more that he just doesn't seem to have been influenced by anyone. Although I'm sure he was. I have no doubt that he was, but he sort of creates it in such a way and achieves such a kind of clarity and simplicity in his style that it just it's a pure cinema, absolutely pure cinema. Very, very rare, even on the part of the greatest directors. Very, very rare. And again, not something you see all the time in the silent era, because they were inventing the medium as they went along. It was all new. They had to be unique, but they hadn't. There was no choice. But very, very rare in sound movies, and particularly in recent sound films. And this is a relatively recent film. Danny Lloyd's performance here is partly so interesting because apparently he had no idea they were making a horror film. Kubrick told him that they were making a drama, I think, and it's very interesting because particularly in the scenes where Nicholson is chasing him with the axe, you never actually, I think maybe only once, and then for only a brief second, but you pretty much never see the two of them in the same shot. And I think the reason for that was to avoid traumatizing Danny Lloyd. They would just sort of, they would shoot his side of the scene, and they would just sort of say, all right, run that way, and look scared, and do that, and open your eyes wide, and stuff. And he never saw the guy with the axe who was supposedly chasing him, and he never saw these horrible things that he was reacting to. You know what I mean? Really, I mean, obviously, the bloody girls in the hallway was never something he saw. He saw the girls, but never the sort of horrific image of them murdered or any of the rest of it. It was all done in these wonderful reaction shots that he has, and it's a wonderful, wonderful performance, I think, and really one of the best performances by a child actor, I think, that I've seen in sort of in modern cinema. It really is fantastic. I think the music here is it's Penderecki, or it's The Dream of Jacob, I think. I think by Penderecki. I'm not entirely sure, which is an absolutely terrifying piece of music, even on its own. Very disturbing and dissonant, and also very beautiful, as is as is The Shining itself. The musical score was put together from bits and pieces. It was kind of a patchwork sort of deal, like most of Kubrick's later movies, a patchwork of different pieces of what I suppose you call modern art music, modern classical music, sort of cut together and occasionally electronically manipulated and things like that. I had a friend actually who I took to see this film, and he was he is a brilliant musician, and one of those people who's been playing since he was like 5 years old, and was a composition. He's now a professor of musical composition at in New Hampshire at a university, and he absolutely loathed this movie because he knew every single piece in it, and he just thought it was so horrendously disrespectful the way they'd cut them up and manipulated them and all the rest of it, and he just couldn't get past the music. He just absolutely hated it, and I think it about 5-10 years later he sort of said, well, I get what Kubrick was after, and I think he'd come to respect Kubrick enough as an artist to sort of acknowledge that the film probably the film had to reign supreme, but yeah, it really pissed him off, as I think Kubrick has actually. His use of classical music has pissed off purists and critics from time to time. The way he manipulates it, occasionally uses it in ways that they don't approve of, and things like that. So this is another scene with very long pauses in it, and the way that Nicholson is just has this demonic look through the whole thing. Nicholson's performance came in for a lot of criticism. Probably the primary criticism of the film, well, there were two major criticisms of the film, one of which is that it was unfaithful to the King novel, which to my mind is, so what? An unfaithful film is perfectly capable of being great. And in this case, it's very good to my mind that it was unfaithful, because I think the book is actually very, very strong in idea and very weak in execution, and this film is very strong in both departments. But the Nicholson's performance being over the top was, I think, a heavier criticism. Because it was accurate, he does go over the top, and also because this film came along at a time where that style of acting, which is a very not necessarily over the top acting, but I mean theatrical acting, unrealistic acting, consciously unrealistic acting, really had fallen into, it still has, and in many ways fallen into total disrepute. Ever since the method sort of took over the world, the method acting style took over the world in the 50s and 60s. Very theatrical styles of acting have tended to be looked down on and seen as being very hammy and melodramatic and all the rest of it. It's at best you'll see it in Shakespeare or something like that. The more classical plays or things of that kind, and I think it's a terrible tragedy, because I think there's I think realism is as much a fantasy or a chimera as anything else. Nothing in film is real. Nothing in art is real. It's all spectacle. It's all manipulation. It's all theater of some one kind or another. And to acknowledge that and to play with that is, to my mind, perfectly legitimate. And I think Nicholson's Kubrick defended it as saying that it was like a Cagney performance, and it reminds me, it's very interesting to me, because Orson Welles once said there's a difference between realistic and true, real and true. Cagney was totally unrealistic. Nobody ever talked or walked or spoke or whatever the way he does in the movies, but he's absolutely true. There's never an untrue moment in any of his acting, and I think the same goes for Nicholson in this movie. Nicholson said it was balletic, and I think that's absolutely what it is. I think it's a wonderful performance. Again, this slowness going into what is obviously a very brightly lit and very modern, white, pretty sort of room in which absolute horror resides. Yeah. Of course, he won't tell us what's in there. This is the only scene, I think, in which these boilers appear, and I think it's remarkable that they built. This entire hotel was a studio set in Boreham Wood Studios in England, and the fact that they must have spent so much time building this set with the boilers and the switches and all the rest of it, and then to end up using it only in one scene. I think it may have been used in a scene that was later cut. I think quite a few scenes were cut from this film and no longer exist. Kubrick destroyed apparently all the outtakes from his various movies at some point late in his life. I presume to avoid the idea of anyone doing to his movies what George Lucas had done to his own films. Going back and sticking crap in them later on. Probably smart of him, to be fully honest with you, to have done that. This is actually very interesting because it's clear that he's already been writing quite a bit, and of course you find out later on the payoff is that all he's been writing this entire time is all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. These long, hurtling Steadicam shots, people go on forever about how Kubrick shot 8 bazillion takes of everything or something like that, but The Shining in particular is where is the most notorious example of Kubrick. I don't know, supposedly shooting, I don't remember what it was, 140 takes of some scenes. I'm sure that there were scenes like that were done for reasons of obsessive compulsive attention to detail, or just the Kubrick sort of the madness in Kubrick's method. However, it is not true that was entirely the case, and in fact most of the scenes in which there were very, very large numbers of retakes were due to technical problems, mainly having to do with the Steadicam, in that the Steadicam was new technology, it was difficult to use, it was a cumbersome, heavy instrument, and it often bounced very badly when the operator stopped, and sort of gravity, inertial forces took over, particularly when you're moving quickly like that, or you're moving in long, complex shots, if something goes wrong, then you have to dial it all the way back to the beginning and do it over again. So I can imagine that these were very long, time-consuming processes getting these shots, and I'm sure it drove the actors out of their minds and the technicians out of their minds and stuff. But it was not entirely because Kubrick was nuts. That's a stereotype, I think, and one that ought to be put in its proper perspective, But as Michael Hare once said, I would never say that Kubrick wasn't a control freak. I'm sure he was, but not to quite such a pathological extent. The most famous, I think, of those multiple take scenes is when she confronts Jack with a baseball bat, and he sort of slowly chases her up the stairwell in this set, and I mean that's all in one or two long, complicated Steadicam shots, and I'm sure they shot that over 100 times. But again, mainly for technical reasons. Again, this extraordinary use of faces, the way he turns faces into tableau, into landscapes, to get a certain effect. Again, the total rejection of realism on a certain level, to say, no, well, I think he once said to Nicholson, yeah, it's real, but it isn't interesting, and Kubrick always goes for what's interesting, rather than necessarily what's real, or even what is necessarily correct in terms of, there are some pretty glaring continuity errors in this film. And people go on and on about Kubrick's obsessiveness, but I think he was willing to go with a mistake if he thought he could get a certain effect out of it. If he thought the film, the cinematic effect, would be better if you accepted the mistake. It seems to me that he was more than willing to do that. It's quite interesting. There's a couple of golden lit shots here that are marvelous. Kubrick told him to imitate the crazy people you saw see in the streets of New York City in this scene. You can definitely, it's a perfect replica, really. These golden shot scenes going into the gold room. This is also a very famous scene that I absolutely love, and wonderfully played by Jack Nicholson. It's funny, it's terrifying, it's over the top, it's subtle, it's in every way brilliant, and also obviously the presence of Joe Turkel, who actually was in paths of glory as one of the soldiers who gets executed, and who his most famous role probably is playing the big corporate boss in the Android Corporation in Blade Runner. I can't believe now I've forgotten the name of the character. But, you know, Rutger Hauer's creator, basically, who eventually has the rather spectacular death of having his brain crushed through his eyes by, by Rutger Hauer. He's marvelous in this movie, and just horrendously creepy. And the way him and Nicholson play off each other is just absolutely classic. And I mean, this set is quite extraordinary. Probably lit largely by natural light. Kubrick had by this time, I think, tried to use natural light in almost everything, and I think in Eyes Wide Shut it was almost exclusively shot in natural light. Yeah, here, hello Lloyd. Again, you just have this straight cut. You know, suddenly Lloyd is there. See, just there, where he wasn't before. Again, it's the uncanny. The thing is suddenly there that shouldn't be there, or has a nature that it shouldn't have. But, you know, he doesn't fade in. He doesn't sort of appear in a blast of light. There isn't any. He doesn't come through the wall. You know, there's nothing fancy done at all. It's just a straight cut. Again, it's absolutely marvelous, I think. And one of the things that makes this film so effective as a horror movie is that by doing that, it arouses that sense of the uncanny, because it makes the abnormal look so normal, and that is often the most disconcerting thing. Most disconcerting effect that you can create with people. And I do think the dialogue in this scene is marvelous. It's one of the few scenes actually where the dialogue, a substantial part of the dialogue is taken from Stephen King's novel, and it is, in this case, it's one of the few moments where there's good dialogue in a Stephen King novel, and it works quite well. Getting back, natural light. Again, it's coming back to that paring down of things to their simplest form. But Kubrick by this time had developed very famously in Barry Lyndon, but I think he continued to use it. He developed a Zeiss. He developed a camera that could use a Zeiss lens that was developed by NASA that could shoot in candlelight and get serviceable exposures in candlelight, and I'm sure some of these scenes probably were shot with that, and have that kind of they have that kind of sense of that sort of warm amberish glow that artificial lighting often won't give you. I think Nicholson's very good there. The way his eyes lit, and you can see the alcoholic going straight off the wagon, you know, and it's just Merry Christmas is what he's thinking, you know. But of course, is it real? Is it actual alcohol? I don't know. People theorize that this movie is essentially all in Nicholson's head. I don't think that's true. Personally, I think it's a genuine ghost story. And again, it's not what Kubrick's interested in. It's not interesting if it's all in Jack Nicholson's head. Evil is interesting. The evil in Jack Nicholson is interesting, but the evil that's in the hotel is also interesting, and the evil of the things that have happened there is interesting, and all the rest of it. You know what I mean? And Kubrick himself explicitly stated that he did want people to wonder whether this was all in Nicholson's head or not, citing a story by Stephen Crane called The Blue Hotel, in which a gambler thinks he's being cheated on in a card game, and eventually it leads to him being shot to death. You think he's paranoid, and it's revealed at the end that in fact he was both paranoid and being cheated. So it's kind of, you know, similar sort of thing. It's like, yeah, Nicholson's evil, but he's also in an evil place, you know, and it's sort of this kind of thing, you know, and he's always been there, as that last photograph shows, you know. But Kubrick did say that he wanted the audience to be wondering through the whole thing as to whether it was just Jack's psychosis or whether this was actually happening. And but he did say, though, that he gave an answer, which is that at the moment when Jack is locked in the storage closet by Wendy, and you know, the ghost caretaker Grady comes and unbolts the door and lets him out. That's the moment when you know that it is in fact supernatural, and he you know, that was his intention. You know, I suppose you can read it however you want, and people do read this film however they want. Unfortunately, you know, it's this sort of you know, I suppose it's inevitable when you make a film. And all of Kubrick's films have a very cultivated ambiguity, and this one does too. I suppose when you do that, you welcome in all the freaks of the world to, you know, believe that you're showing how you're in the Illuminati, or you faked the moon landing, or I don't know, you're a mutant from Mars, or it's just endless. This is the ridiculousness. I only find it problematic because it leads people away from analyzing what actually is in the film. In other words, what actually is in the movie. There are things that there are not hidden meanings, but there are deeper meanings, deeper resonances. There is a symbolism to this movie, and the use of visual symbolism, things like that. But none of them have anything to do with conspiracy theories to fake the moon landing, or anything like that. They have to do with the very basic symbols of horror tales, and what the horror tale has to say about the human psyche and human psychology and human behavior, and human fear, and what it says about evil, what it says about death, what it says about the degradation and destruction of our bodies, all the things that are there, but we don't really want to know about. Those things are hugely interesting. The whole technique of the way the film is made, is using its place in the history of the horror film. All these things are very interesting, and those things just seem to get ignored for the sake of talking about, the Illuminati and the reptilian men from Venusia or whatever. It's just ridiculous, unfortunately. And there's very, very little actually good analysis of The Shining. This is one of my favorite scenes in the picture. And again, these long, beautiful zoom outs that Kubrick used so well. And mainly, the opening shot in A Clockwork Orange is the most famous, but again, such a simple technique, but creating such an extraordinary effect of the room just sort of slowly enlarging, rather than pulling back. And this is, I think, Scatman Crothers' greatest moment by far, and probably the greatest moment with faces in Kubrick. He uses distorted faces quite often. 2001, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, but I think this is the greatest of them all. And what happens with Scatman Crothers' face here, it just completely distorts out of all recognition and becomes this mask of absolute horror, absolute terror, anguish, and the heartbeats and that little electronic hum coming in, and I think the first time you see this, it just really does give you chills, And then again, there's just a very simple cut to Danny to indicate that he's sending this, inducing this in Halloran in some way, or there's some sort of connection between him and Halloran. It's not explicitly, yeah. That room 237 is come alive. In the book, it's very explicitly stated that Danny sends him a psychic message. It's left a bit more ambiguous here, but I think you get that somehow a connection has been made between the two of them, and Halloran now knows that something horrible is happening, and the evil of the hotel has awakened. This is one of the few scenes in the movie where Kubrick does go for a kind of very pure horror film gore, in a way. This kind of grand Grignol tradition of the horror movie. There isn't actually all that much of that in The Shining. Very little, actually, for a mainstream horror film. Certainly compared to, like, The Exorcist, even, or any slasher movie. There's Hostel is infinitely more gory than this film. It is made extremely disturbing, I think, because it's connected to sex. It's connected. So you have the beautiful naked woman, and then you have the ugly old woman, and the ugly decayed, decomposed old woman, and it speaks to that horrible, unconscious, sometimes conscious fear we all have of the eventual degradation and destruction of our own bodies, whether by age or by death or by other means. And so I think it is slightly more, if you like, than just your kind of typical Hollywood gore scene, although it is extremely disgusting and off-putting. I've never quite been able to tell if she's shot in slow motion or not. I think it might be shot slightly. It might be slightly overcranked. I don't think it's in sort of full slow motion. I don't think it's double the normal frame rate, but I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. It is it is overcranked. I think a little bit. But it's hard to tell if it's the grace of her movements or if it's something that's being done in camera. Yeah. it's I love how Nicholson becomes, his whole look becomes more and more animalistic, more and more bestial as the film goes on, and until eventually he sort of just seems to become this sort of wild beast, this kind of wolf-like half werewolf, sort of character, half man, half wolf. I think he actually played a werewolf in one of his later movies. I think directed by Mike Nichols. I think I can't remember the name of it. It might have been just called Wolf, but I don't completely remember. And I think this also points to, again, to get pretentious, the Freudian idea of the connection between sex and death. The idea that the eros drive, the drive towards reproduction and sexuality and life is intimately connected to also the desire for senescence and death and destruction, death drive. And that here, obviously, you're seeing basically the two sides of that, driven up out of the sort of instinctual thing that the unhuman thing that Jack Nicholson is becoming. And I think it's already the old lady here, if I'm not mistaken. Could be wrong. And of course, it happens in a mirror. Dear God, it must have been horrifying to shoot that. It really is gross. I mean, you have to admit, when Kubrick wanted to go for gross, he was pretty good at it. Really disgusting. But yeah, it's this horrible decomposing. This actually, I think, is from the book. There is a reference to a woman who dies and decomposes in the bar. It might have been murdered or something and decomposes in the bathtub. It's obviously not. It's not given any context. It's not spelled out in any way in the film. She's just kind of there as this horrific image. And of course, Jack comes down and very calmly says, nothing happened. I didn't find anything. And it says, you kind of think, well, did it happen then? Has it been erased? Has he gone crazy? The whole sequence with Halloran, sort of making his run up to save Danny, is truncated in the version that Kubrick released in Europe. Actually, quite a bit of the film is shortened in the version he released in Europe. That was entirely his decision. He was not, I think, pushed in any way to shorten the film. But the reaction on the part of American critics and audiences had been somewhat ambivalent, and again, as it usually is, one of the complaints is that it was too long and too slow, and so he cut quite a few expositional scenes and speeded things up a little bit. I actually think the shorter cut is interesting in some ways, because it does move at a faster clip and is more kind of essentially a horror film. Although I do prefer the longer version. I think it has more of a hypnotic quality. I actually like the slowness, although I often like slow movies in general. To be honest, I'm a little unusual in that sense. But I think that something that gives you the time to sort of wallow in what's going on and to pay it the proper attention is often more interesting than something that sort of tries to dazzle you with footwork and sort of blast past you as quickly as possible. I think from this scene on, Shelley Duvall is crying pretty much all the time. Which, I mean, she spoke of as being very demanding, and the crew spoke of as being very demanding, and the speculation is that a lot of the way that Kubrick treated her, and deliberately sort of treating her badly and harshly, was deliberately to conjure up this state of sort of near hysteria that she's in for the last. It's almost the last third, at least, of the film, if not more than that. And it's interesting because in this Nicholson, it starts off calm, and then sort of shoots off, whereas she's a bit overwrought right from the beginning. It's a kind of reversal. Um, it's also it's also an indication, I think, of how good Nicholson is, and that he can actually be fairly persuasive in this scene, even though you've seen what happened in the room. You know, you actually sort of want to believe him. You know? And I love how they telegraph the fact that Danny can hear them just by slightly echoing the dialogue. You know, nothing too crazy. The famous red rum, another thing that everybody remembers from this film. Murder spelled backwards. You know. This film sort of met with the same reception that pretty much all of Kubrick's films have met with, which is an initial ambivalence, and even dislike, and then a kind of slow reevaluation during which it sinks completely into the public consciousness in one way or another. And like I said, images from it start appearing in all kinds of surprising places. And then suddenly achieving this extraordinary status of a classic. And interestingly enough, you know, a lot of people complained at the time that Kubrick didn't really know how to make horror films, and the film really wasn't all that scary. And it was, you know, it was unfaithful to King, who was the master of horror, and all this other stuff. And now, if you look at any list of the top 10 horror films, basically The Exorcist and The Shining trade number 1 and number 2. You know, and with very, very little variation. And among genre fans, this is now almost universally considered if not the greatest horror film ever made, then one of the 5 greatest horror films ever made. And I think among critics as well, it's risen enormously risen in esteem. And, I think at least in the popular culture, it may actually be the best known of all of Kubrick's films, more so even than 2001, and A Clockwork Orange, which obviously has had a certain impact on the culture. Yeah, again, this is another great. It's just there all of a sudden, you know. And the music, I love the music in this dance sequence, the Midnight, the Stars, and You, which is just a wonderfully, you know, sort of haunting, a little slightly chilling melody, particularly in the context in which it's placed. I guess at Halloran's sort of rescue run is cut down. I kind of like the tension that it builds up by following him getting there, and I also like excuse me, I also like the fact that it's a red herring in a way, because obviously he goes in there and he immediately gets killed. Which doesn't happen in the book, by the way. In the book, he survives and does rescue them. So people do sort of say, well, that makes the whole trip pointless, and therefore Kubrick's making a misanthropic statement. It's not entirely true, because what Halloran does do is bring the snowcat, and Jack has disabled the other snowcat, so Wendy and Danny can escape because of the snowcat that Halloran's brought with him, even though Halloran himself has not survived. So it does actually still fulfill that plot purpose. I think it was more to shock the audience, you know, and to give him a good murder at the end. Also, of course, you know, Kubrick did pull the tricks as good as anyone else. Yeah, one should remember that. You know what I mean? He was not a purist by any means. With the Stars and You. It's such a strange song, so evocative of its period, and exactly the sort of music that should not be there. It's fantastic. And here he is again. And of course, this is all leading into the meeting with Grady, the caretaker, who's played. I can't actually quite remember his name. But he's played by a guy who I think was in Barry Lyndon and was in A Clockwork Orange. and is actually was a fairly well-known British actor. He was in some TV series. He's in an episode of Yes Minister, actually, the British political comedy. Really a trip to see him in it, to see him in a comedic role. Although it's very interesting because actually seeing him like that, it turns out that the voice he uses as Grady is not his real voice. The accent is not his, and he's also speaking in a slightly higher register, which I think maybe contributes a bit to how eerie Grady is and how sort of strange he seems. There's just something wrong with him, and besides the fact that he's a ghostly serial killer, but you know, but he's by far, I think, the creepiest of all the ghosts, of all the characters in the film. And this famous scene in the bathroom that we're about to go into has also been fairly widely imitated. Just a couple of months ago, I actually saw an episode of Hannibal, the television show, in which there was a set which was pretty much a carbon copy of the bathroom they go into. Ironically enough, it was only used for budgetary reasons. There was some shooting with this number of extras, and with the kind of equipment you needed to do this scene in a room, in a set this big, became prohibitive at a certain point. And this whole conversation, I think, was meant to take place in the actual dancing hall itself, and due to the need to rein in the budget a little bit. Kubrick, I think, didn't care so much about the schedule, but I've heard he did care about the budget. And then this was turned into what the Brits call a two-hander, with just two actors in a small set, and of course it looks extraordinary, that blood red against the white, based, I think, from what I've read, on a bathroom that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, of all people. Now this is another famous and probably the most prominent scene where Kubrick breaks the 180 rule, and there he did it right there. And he does it several times in this scene, and it's almost always in a moment where something telling is being said, or something odd is being said, some change is occurring in the course of this conversation. And again, I think Nicholson's marvelous in this. The dynamics of the emotion. Kubrick actually, I think, commented on what a difficult scene this was for him, because of how Nicholson sort of had to turn on a dime in response to everything that the guy is the Grady is saying. And of course Grady isn't giving him much to play off, because Grady, what's so creepy about Grady is how flat he speaks and how completely affectless he is, even when he's saying these horrifying things. So Nicholson was having to basically conjure up these emotional twists and turns without really much to help him, and I think it's brilliantly done. There are people, as there are people who say everything about The Shining, there are people who say that every time Nicholson speaks to a ghost or looks at a ghost, he's actually looking in a mirror. As far as I can tell in this scene, that is not the case. He is looking at Grady several times. There is often a mirror present. That is true. Although there's mirrors present in several other scenes in the film, and mirrors are a very common visual motif in movies for obvious reasons, and I don't think that necessarily has much significance. See there, he's very obviously looking at straight at Grady. Again, I think it's this desire to see secrets where they don't exist. Kubrick's longtime producer, Jan Harlan, has testified to the fact that a lot of the various theories made up about The Shining are just complete nonsense, and oftentimes the things that people think are so deliberate and unusual were done for purely practical reasons, having nothing to do with any hidden message. This is where Grady just a wonderfully creepy character. You've always been the caretaker. It's such quotable stuff too. I mean, people will come back at you with these lines, over and over again. Like the "Come play with us, Danny" line, and the "Here's Johnny" obviously is just endlessly quoted. It's probably more famous now from this film than it is from the Johnny Carson show. I mean, the Johnny Carson's been off the air for so long, and I think eventually the use of it in this film will overwhelm any reference to Carson. And now you see Grady's expression stays completely the same, more or less, all the way through. And here Nicholson is completely different. Whereas before he was sort of smiling and being smartass, now all of a sudden he's kind of astonished and all the rest of it. Big performance, big emotions. You know what I mean? I think it works actually wonderfully in this film. Unfortunately, actually, its effect on Nicholson's career was not the greatest. It became so indelible and so identified with him that for a while he was almost unable to take on really serious acting roles. If you look at the roles he took in the 80s and early 90s as compared to the roles he took in the 70s, they're much more caricaturish and more over the top in a bad way. I think mainly because he became so identified with this role, and people have said that if you watch the first Batman movie where he plays the Joker against Michael Keaton, which I actually think is a wonderful film, he's basically playing Jack Torrance again, as essentially the character he plays in The Shining, and it's absolutely true. It's a wonderful performance. I mean, I think it's a fantastic performance. In that case, it works because it's a comic book film. But I think in some of the other movies he's done, it just doesn't work, and I think he's just called upon to do Jack Torrance over and over again. And occasionally he does. People I think have realized his value as an actor and his immense talent also to underplay roles. And The Pledge, that's been mainly due to Sean Penn in some ways, because I think both the Crossing Guard and The Pledge are marvelous performances by Nicholson, very much the equal of his 70s work. One sort of wishes that perhaps it's somewhat Kubrick's fault in creating such a kind of memorable performance. Whether one thinks it's good or bad, nobody forgets it. Nobody gets away from "Here's Johnny." You know what I mean? It's not going anywhere. But I wonder if this ultimately will be the performance that Nicholson is most remembered for. I wouldn't be surprised. And the way that Cagney, is just sort of written into everybody's minds as the character from Public Enemy. When he played so many other things and so many diverse roles and stuff, there's often that one performance that sticks with people. Brando in Streetcar Named Desire, or Brando in The Godfather, being the older, his older self. Shelley Duvall, as far as the rest of her career, was pretty scattershot after this. I think Kubrick may have made her gun shy, to be fully honest. She mainly, I think, and this is also, I think, part of the reason why she had such a difficult time on this film is she really mainly was a member of sort of Robert Altman's informal stock company, and she mostly played ensemble roles in Robert Altman's films. The only exception being her performance as Olive Oyl in Popeye, which is probably the only really great thing about that movie. She's so sort of perfect for that role in every way. But she. She isn't really a leading actress, and I do think, she may have shied away from working with other directors. And certainly Robert Altman's style is so different from Kubrick's. Altman being very freeform, freewheeling, letting the actors do pretty much whatever they want to do and things like that. And Kubrick being extremely precise and domineering and dictatorial in many ways and wanting things the way he wanted them. Although, from what I understand, he did give actors a large amount of freedom at certain points to sort of do what they wanted. But he wanted what he wanted first, and then you could sort of go, and see if you could find something better. But you were going to do what he was going to say at some point, whereas Altman... I think often went in not knowing what he was going to get. Altman himself actually told a very interesting story about a shot in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where McCabe lights a cigar. And it's sort of a long shot where McCabe lights a cigar, and you see the glow from his match. And Kubrick apparently called him up to ask him how he got it. You know what I mean? And he sort of described how he did it. And Kubrick said, "Well, how could you be sure that you got it?" You know, and Altman was like, "Well, I just felt that we got it." You know, and Kubrick just could not comprehend that. You know, it just seemed like such remarkable carelessness to him. You know, and I can imagine that for Shelley Duvall, coming out of having worked more or less exclusively with Altman into a situation like working with Kubrick, must have been a hell of a shock to the system, and may have scared her off of working with other directors. She's done a few things since then, and she has actually, in retrospect, spoken highly of Kubrick and highly of the experience, but been very, very emphatic about never wanting to do anything like it again. So. Again, this heartbeat theme. Again, a very simple idea and something that's been done many times before. But and in The Exorcist, I actually see some influence from The Exorcist in this. Some of the use of the zooms, and also the use of the heartbeat, and even the use of some of the music. I think Penderecki is used at some point in The Exorcist. Maybe even the opening credits of The Exorcist. There's a slight there's a clip, a small cue from Penderecki. But again, it's you know, if you have something effective, you know, that's simple, then use it. You know, don't fix what ain't broke. I think Americans say. I don't remember anymore. I've been an expatriate for too long. You know, again, it's all of these shots of Halloran and all of these shots in the Ranger Station, for example, are exactly the same shot. There's very little shift in the Ranger Station. There's no shift in the composition whatsoever. And in the shots with Halloran, there's almost none. And again, it's that thing of not of being able to walk away from things, which is so interesting because everyone sees Kubrick as the director who could never walk away from things. But it seems very obvious that he was capable of doing so if he thought that he'd gotten it right. You know, obviously, the fear that you may not have gotten it right can become all-consuming, and I'm sure it did consume him at certain points. But he definitely seems to have been capable. You know, I wouldn't say that it was something that completely took him over. Another one of these long zoom outs. I think this did survive into the European print. This shot. I mean, they had to keep some of it. You know, to keep that sort of storyline moving. I think a lot of this part of the score is just electronic. You know, I think Wendy Carlos, who was an electronic musician who worked with Kubrick quite a bit, started in Clockwork Orange, said in a documentary on Kubrick that it was a lot of splicing together weird noises, as she put it. You know, electronic sounds and you know, high pitched, varying pitch. Squeals and sparks and things like that, bonging noises to get an effect, you know what I mean, and stuff like that, and even cutting together the various pieces of music to achieve that. So I imagine this is a real second unit shot. All the snow that's actually around the hotel and even the exterior of the hotel in terms of the shots in the running out into the hedge maze and things like that is all salt and bits of again, another English word I can't remember. Styrofoam. Styrofoam chips, bits and pieces of styrofoam chips, and it looks extraordinary. It really does. It looks brilliant. I've always wondered where they did that shot in the airport. I've always wondered, because they must have built it as a set, because none of the principal actors, from what I understand, were ever on location, and I wonder if they just redressed something, or if they actually built that entire set just to get that one shot that was then cut out in the European version. Love to know. It'd be very interesting if they did. The actor here who's playing the owner of the garage was apparently an excellent chess player, and there's actually, I think there's a photograph of Kubrick playing chess with him, and I think he may actually beaten Kubrick once or twice, which if that's true would have been quite a feat, as Kubrick was known for being a very skillful chess player, a former chess hustler in George Washington Park in New York City as a youth. Although I wonder how much he was actually a hustler. I think he may have played for money at certain points, but I doubt that he financed himself or anything through chess gambling. Again, these would all be process shots, and very good process shots actually. You very rarely, again, the process shots in Kubrick films are almost always completely flawless. You never see the kind of artificiality that other directors will often either let slide or even embrace. I mean, I think Hitchcock, for example, really didn't mind, a lot of those rear projection scenes where it's pretty obviously a rear projection shot. I don't think that ever bothered Hitchcock, because he felt that he was making fantasies. He felt that he was making dream films, nightmarish films and things like that. But it's very interesting how Kubrick relates to realism. He kind of wants a realistic background. He wants a realistic setting. He wants a realistic situation. But then he will quite often use performances and behavior that is not at all realistic, and that is very, very theatrical, particularly in his later movies. Again, although that's not always the case. Sometimes the opposite is the case. Clockwork Orange, for example, has several sets that are completely fantastical. The opening milk bar, for example, is an obvious example. And I think the orgy scene in Eyes Wide Shut is extremely theatrical, extremely overwrought, over the top. Actually, several of the sets in Eyes Wide Shut are like that. And then on the other end, you have stuff like 2001, which is a fantasy, and yet everything, the sets and all the technology and everything is done to be hyper real, and then all of a sudden you have this extraordinary luxury hotel room, and at the end of the film, somehow symbolizing, the rebirth of the universe or the rebirth of humanity or something like that. So there's this constant, I think, ambivalence about realism in Kubrick. A striving after it, and at the same time a very conscious rejection of it. Again, it may simply come down to what what's interesting, but what interested him. Because I think he was very interested, for example, in the reality of spacecraft. What would spacecraft really be like? Whereas he was not at all interested in the reality of a place where a kind of dream orgy would happen. Well, what would it look like in the dream? If it's a fantasy, if it's an erotic dream or an erotic nightmare, well, what, then run with that, you know what I mean? Why not? And here we're coming into the all-famous, infinitely copied, infinitely parodied scene, "Oh, work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." You can see even just from these opening moments how complex these Steadicam shots are, and the blocking utilizes an enormous amount of the room, and there's a lot of twists and turns, and all of the intercut, several shots are intercut. I think there's probably 2 or 3 long Steadicam shots that are intercut. I don't remember precisely, but and the point being is that if there was a technical problem with any one of those shots or any one of those takes, then you'd have to go back right from the beginning. This is, to me, is again one of Kubrick's classically simple compositions. Just that low angle, her in the center, full, face on, nothing fancy at all, and then, and there it is. Can't remember if there's a zoom in here or not. Now, of course, this is a beautiful twist because it's shown you that he's been crazy from the beginning. Basically, this has not been a slow descent. And everything now that you've thought about your husband is a lie. It's all been a farce. I love his use of the zoom. It's something very, very few people make use of anymore, and I wish they would. There's so many great old film techniques that are just dismissed now in favor of well, CGI is going to solve everything, I suppose people think. but you can do so many things just in camera. You know. Supposedly someone typed all these out. I imagine because of the different formats and stuff they probably had to. That probably did happen. Some people say Kubrick typed them out himself. I think that's almost certainly nonsense. I find it just extremely unlikely. But you know, yeah, they had to be in different formats. There had to be mistakes and things. I can see Kubrick insisting on that being actually physically written out. Must have been a nightmare for whoever did it. But it does have, there's reason to it, which is that it does look like how someone who was slightly crazed would type, with all the misspellings and, you know, all the crazy different ways of writing it down and all the rest of it, you know. This is a great Orson Welles moment. Welles really, to me, is the master of this, of people walking in out of the shot. Seems to be a point of view shot, but isn't. It's what the shadow emerges, you know. This always reminds me of the Simpsons parody of this, where he's written, was it "No beer, no TV make Homer go crazy"? It's a brilliant parody of it. Again, it's the level of intensity that the two of them sustain in this scene is extraordinary, and especially considering the number of times they must have had to do it. It's just amazing. And I mean the degree of tension that's built over, and the sigh of relief. I actually did see this with an audience, and I mean the sigh of relief. I saw this on the big screen once in a repertory theater, and the sigh of relief that you hear from the audience when she finally whacks him in the face with the baseball bat. I mean, it's it's very audible. You know, a strong sort of gushing exhalation of tension. You know what I mean? And again, there's a lot of stopping and starting. It's just a hugely complex shot to do, a series of shots to do with a new technology, you know. And again, Danny, and the blood used to, and now the blood having completely filled the room, that being used to, it is a symbol to symbolize that things have now unleashed themselves completely. There's nothing. In an odd way, the scene with the elevators is a kind of timer. So it sort of lets you know how far things are going, you know. And now you know that it's full scale, and that a horrible eruption of violence is now inevitable. Nicholson's emphasis on every single line, you know, it's this thing. But you can really see what Shelley Duvall is going through here. I mean, she's essentially on the verge of a nervous breakdown through this whole scene, and you know, and having to face off against Nicholson, who's emoting with everything he's got, and her having to bottle it in while at the same time be crying and weepy and indicating, you know, just how out of control she is. You know, it's desperately, you know, she's desperately trying to hang on to some sort of last thread of sanity and the last hope that he might still be sane, you know, and you know, I mean, what it must have taken out of her to sustain that, just physically even, just you know, sustaining that kind of that voice, that desperate voice. I mean, how long can you do that before your voice just dies? You know what I mean? It must have been incredibly grueling for her, and for Nicholson as well, I imagine. And I'm sure that to be undone by technical problems also would have led to an enormous amount of anger and resentment, you know, just because it seems so ridiculous, you know, it's supposed to be professionals and that sort of thing. But I mean, if you look at what was achieved, I mean, this is you know, this is one of Kubrick's masterpiece scenes in a career full of masterpiece scenes, and maybe, you know, it's just this marathon of terror and tension and fear, and it just will not let you go until the very last minute. And yeah, you know, you that takes hard work. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes hard work to make a movie. It takes a lot of hard work to make a great movie. It certainly takes an enormous amount of hard work, and just a great scene takes an enormous amount of hard work. This is truly horrible, because this, to me, is when he reveals, I think, the truth. I think he's wanted to kill her from the beginning of this. You know, people, husbands and wives and all that, often, I imagine, think at some point or another, you know, I'd like to kill him, I'd like to kill her. I'm sure that runs through people's minds when they're in long-term relationships, and now this has reached the point where it's actually going to happen. Again, it's that thing of it's always in us, you know what I mean? I mean, his resentment of her and his disrespect of her, his abuse of her is very clear right from the beginning, but, you know, and now it's reached this kind of fever pitch, you know. In a way, this is what Kubrick's been building to the entire scene, is this, finally, this explosion of all these, this hidden violence, this hidden tension that's been within this family unit, and the degree to which the father hates his wife, hates his son, you know, wants to destroy them. You know, it's pretty terrifying stuff, and of course that moment, just this enormous sigh of relief, and of course then stopping, because everyone's terrified that, like in every horror movie, he's going to get up and attack her again, which to Kubrick's credit, he does not do. I think I think Nicholson here plays being unconscious better than in any other any other actor in any other movie I've ever seen, or rather, he plays waking up from unconsciousness. You know, in most movies, you know, they open their eyes and come around and sort of rub their head. You know, in reality, if you've been whacked on the head with a baseball bat, I mean, you don't come back for a good long while, and it takes you a long time to come back to full consciousness, and the damage, the concussion is pretty brutal. You know, people often will throw up and things like that. You know, so. And of course, it makes the suspense almost unbearable, because you wonder, well, is he going to come around enough to get to her before she opens the door? You know, from here on to the end is basically, I mean, nonstop. You know, there's not a silent moment. There's not a moment without tension and horror through the entire film. As I was saying about the horrible nature of what's going on with Jack Nicholson, his desire to kill his wife, his desire to kill his son, that's there in him from the beginning. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Kubrick... Well, again, it's the thing of being honest. You know, I regret to say that fathers kill their sons, and fathers kill their wives. You know, family members kill other family members. All the time. It's hardly unknown. Horrible crimes occur in families, sometimes especially in families, and the idea that what Stephen King was getting at, of this kind of this poor abused child growing up to abuse his children and all the rest of it, isn't the point, really. You know, I think Kubrick's trying to get at the universality of this phenomenon, and it's all in us to some degree, this kind of horror. You know, maybe in some ways all horror stories are cautionary tales in that sense. I don't know. Maybe. It's certainly something we need, though. They've been around for centuries, and they'll be around for centuries more, whether as a formal genre or not. You know, we need to confront our fears. You know, and this is maybe the safest way to do it. You know, there's a very famous moment in the documentary that Vivian Kubrick made, The Making of The Shining, where you actually see Kubrick preparing to shoot that scene. That low angle shot of Nicholson, you see him and Kubrick setting it up with it's very interesting, actually. Film too short, I think, but it's very cool to see. There's one of the only pieces of film showing Kubrick actually directing something. You know, it's a very, very funny, looking and sounding exactly like a Bronx rabbi. It's hilarious. Exactly the last thing you'd expect Stanley Kubrick to look and sound like. You know, very funny. Again, you can see how Nicholson just is flying. It's such a manic performance in some ways. It's just flying between emotional states, and flying between the expression on his face changes from second to second. And then I don't think any of it's unconscious. I don't think any of it is just him being wild the way maybe it was in other films. I think he's very, very aware of what he's doing. You know. But yeah, again, to sustain this actually reminds me a bit of Toshiro Mifune's performance in Seven Samurai, which has that same kind of ferocity to it. And I think maybe because Seven Samurai is a foreign film, it's much easier for critics to accept that kind of theatrical style of acting than it is in an English language movie. I noticed that in foreign language movies, especially non-European foreign language movies, critics very rarely get agitated about the things they get agitated about in English language movies. Acting, for example, you know what I mean? They very rarely sort of say, well, this was over the top, or this was a bad performance, or something. Very rarely criticize the acting, maybe because they think, well, it's in another language, I can't grasp it, which I don't think is true. It's not in films, certainly. You know, so much of it is wrapped up in the visual and the tone of voice and things like that. But I always wonder if a scene was cut showing him sabotaging the snowcat. I don't know. But it's a complaint that's been made about all of Kubrick's later films, is that the acting in it is unnatural, and that there's a theatricality to an artificiality to the acting that people didn't like, and critics especially didn't like. And you know, again, it's like the argument that he's cold and detached, or he takes a God's eye view of things. It's kind of like, well, even if it's true, so what? It's of no relevance whatsoever, to my mind. And here's the reveal, or at least what to Kubrick was the reveal. It's a very quiet reveal, but to him, this moment is the moment when you realize that it's all real. It's all been happening, and that the ghosts are real. The evil of the hotel is real. The sort of supernatural power of the hotel is real. The name of Grady supposedly changes. Charles Grady is the murderous caretaker mentioned in the opening scene, and Delbert Grady is this caretaker who has the conversation with Nicholson. People talk about whether that has some significance or not. It could actually just be a continuity error. It's by no means impossible. There's several continuity errors, and I hope I remember. There's a big one, actually, in one of the most famous scenes that hopefully I'll remember to point out. Or it may just be an attempt at sort of misdirection, confusion, and again, to give the audience just a certain, maybe even somewhat subconscious sense of being dislocated and unsettled. But I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if it was just a mistake. Even the masters make mistakes. Sometimes the masters most of all, because they've stopped caring about that, started caring about more important things. Yeah, see, I think that is true, and I think that Wendy is stronger than she appears, and I think again that undercuts one of the main arguments against her character, and I think she does. The idea that she's just a weak, mousy woman and is even a slightly misogynistic stereotype, I think, is really just totally wrong. I think she proves to be extremely resourceful, and I think what the Ghost Grady is saying here is quite true. She does manage to outdo him. She gets the better of him, as he says, and she does rescue her son at the end, and the son defeats the murderous father and is saved by his mother, and I think that she is actually a character who develops over the course of the film, and yeah, I think in a much more interesting way than the character in the book does. I think that she goes from being that very weak, sort of submissive, abused wife to someone who is very much the kind of lioness protecting her cub, and as much as she's terrified, she succeeds. She manages it. I think that really, I find the criticism of her character very, very sort of strange and willful in a way. I mean, I think and people see what they want to see in that case. I think Halloran looks so strange in this scene. He's got an almost skull-like look to him, which I think maybe is intentional. He is going to his oncoming death, So, and these scenes are beautiful. I don't know if these were second unit or studio shots. I'd imagine they'd almost have to be studio, because I don't know how you'd shoot this in a snowstorm. But here's another scene that everybody always remembers: the red rum shot. It is a cheap trick. Let's face it. Murder spelled backwards. It's very much a kind of Stephen King, Penny Dreadful sort of trick. And of course, it's a trick because it works. It works beautifully. And that is an intimidating knife, I must say. It does scare the hell out of the audience. And of course, Kubrick has one of his great zoom-ins on the words in the mirror and all that. So it is one of those moments that has written itself indelibly onto the pop cultural consciousness of the Western world. I think it's also interesting in that Kubrick is it can be a very great mistake to sort of idolize or to idealize Kubrick as an artist. I think he was an artist. I think he was a great artist, one of the greatest artists in cinema. And I think he ultimately viewed himself as an artist and wanted to be an artist. He was also a filmmaker who was working in a film industry, and he understood that was an industry, and he understood that to remain an artist, and especially to maintain his freedom, his creative freedom, which he did manage to maintain to the end of his life, which is a remarkable feat that pretty much no other director has succeeded in, both to guard that and to be consistently successful at it. He understood the fact that you were dealing with a medium that had to answer to a mass audience, ultimately. You can't make films just for yourself, And I actually don't think any artist should make something just for themselves ever. You know what I mean? You always want to. I think you always have to be conscious of who you're talking to in a way. Art is a form of communication. Yeah, this is it. It's really a terrifying shriek the boy has there. Yeah, these two great zooms. It really makes it. And here comes the all-famous moment. As I was saying, he and I think even making a horror film was, for Kubrick in some ways, was a strategic decision. Barry Lyndon had not done well, and he needed to make a movie that would give him commercial legitimacy again. That he also managed to make it into a great work of art is, I think, a testimony to his skill. And the way that he uses these various tricks and trades of the horror genre, upending some and making use of others. Again, to my mind, is very very conscious and modest. I think not trying to be not trying to go too far with himself. As self-indulgent as people accuse him of, he wasn't always. In many ways he was very modest in some ways in terms of the demands that were made on filmmakers, economically and in terms of the audience, and in terms of the classical structures of the medium. He respected them and also deranged them, but you can't derange something you don't respect in the first place. I think you just can't. And here comes the all-famous line. For some reason, there is something terrifying about an axe in a horror movie. I don't know what it is, but in the book, it's some sort of weird croquet mallet. It's just very stupid. I think it doesn't work at all, and the axe is so much more powerful and just more terrifying. Axe murderers, for some reason, are particularly terrifying to people. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it just looks like such a vicious weapon. I don't know. This is all Nicholson at his both most charismatic and most deranged, and also, it has to be admitted, is most over the top, is most completely theatrical. You know what I mean? Balletic, as he put it. That's all set. And she fairly effectively defends herself here. I mean, she's screaming and freaking out while it's going on, of course. I mean, she's not an action hero, but she does manage to stop him. This very simple swing movement, you know. I think this scene was used in some of the posters. It is really, I mean, Shelley Duvall is doing here is pretty extraordinary. It's just absolutely terrifying. And it's very long. It's a very long, sustained shot, which I think is much more effective than if you cut it. This has a slight distortion in it, I think. It's almost like a slight fisheye quality to it, which I think is very effective. Only time that shot is used. Here it is. Nicholson improvised that. There it is. Now there's a pretty... Yeah, it's a great music cue. There's a pretty big continuity error here, which I think, again, speaks to the fact that Kubrick was not the compulsive perfectionist people say he was. He wasn't obsessed with technical perfection over everything else. Yeah, here it is. Both panels here are axed in, of the door are axed in, whereas you only saw one previously. So clearly there was a longer scene in which he cut through both panels and has now been interrupted by Halloran. And obviously it was just because the effect, I guess, was better. With a shorter scene, you know, he allowed that to go forward. I have to say, I didn't notice it until, I don't know, it's the fifth or sixth time I ever saw the film. I mean, most people don't, because the intensity that's conjured up is so powerful. And what you're really paying attention to is the fact that Halloran's here and you think he's going to save the day, you know. You know, so it really, to my mind, it really does show that that to get, if the cinematic effect was good, then he would go with it. It wasn't, you know, he wasn't a complete megalomaniac about those sorts of things. The limp also, I think, gives him a very animalistic look, a kind of vaguely non-human look that he's reverting back to a more savage kind of hominid creature, regressing back into man's savage past. You know, something that fascinated Kubrick. You know, so the man, when people criticized Clockwork Orange, he said that you know, man isn't a noble savage; he's an ignoble savage, and that's what Nicholson's playing here, really. Yeah, again, this is all blue filters, lights, salt, styrofoam, and a wind machine. You know, I mean, it looks perfect. Absolutely perfect. These shots of Nicholson are so iconic. You know, I mean, they just stick in the mind forever. There's the elevators that will disgorge the blood eventually. Again, it's not clear. He's going upstairs to the entrance, and it sort of doesn't make, you know, it doesn't quite make sense. I think some rather nerdy fellow once, yeah, and then the entrance is over there, and it's like, wow, you know, some rather nerdy fellow actually mapped out the Overlook Hotel apparently and found out that it made no sense whatsoever. I don't know. It may have simply been done for what was practical to build what set where, you know, and how to connect them into each other. But it does give, again, that feeling of the labyrinth, you know. And of course, now the monster and the labyrinth is very much alive and very much waiting for his moment to strike. I find this scene just, I mean, it's still just the tension is just almost unbearable. Because I keep forgetting which pillar Nicholson is behind, and I'm always expecting him to jump out from behind the next pillar, and it's just like I'm like, waiting for it and waiting for it and waiting for it, And I mean, Kubrick does hold the shot for a very long time, Yeah, it's one of his classic long takes, and that just builds up the tension more and more and more and more and more. The longer it goes on and the quieter it is, the more terrified the audience is going to be. It's a trick that a lot of horror movies miss, unfortunately. M. Night Shyamalan's films sometimes have it, actually, but a lot of conventional horror movies don't. Yeah, there it is. And here the cuts are actually very fast. This here is, yeah. That's the classic, Jack Nicholson, crazy Jack Torrance shot. I mean, this whole movie just sticks in your mind to such an extent. I think, and again, it's because of Kubrick's, I think his willingness to go beyond realism into what would stick in the mind, what would be interesting. This is the only scene I think where you see the kid and Nicholson in the same shot. Nicholson with the axe, I mean, in the same shot. A lot of these scenes of her seeing the horrors of the hotel were cut from the European version, and that's actually somewhat understandable. I mean, they're actually not a huge loss to my mind, although visually they're fairly interesting, and they have confounded fans of the film for years in terms of particularly we're about to see the furry. The whatever it is, a bear or something, I don't know. Yeah, the bear, giving a blowjob to some old guy in there. Yeah, this is actually from Stephen King's book. This is all quite eloquently explained about these two gay lovers who are in the closet or whatever. I think they murder each other. Some sort of thing, horrible thing happens to them or whatever. But anyway, it's left totally ambiguous in the film, and fans are still running around trying to figure out what it means, and same old, I suppose. This to me is actually my favorite part of the film. The chase through the labyrinth, I think, is the most interesting, the most powerful, and the most sort of the deepest part of the film. This is where we really get into it. The chase, because all these sorts of stories do ultimately lead. The story of the labyrinth leads, climaxes in the battle with the monster. In this case, it's a battle of wits, because Danny is a child. He's not powerful enough to physically resist his father, but he's smart enough to resist him, particularly in this bestial state. But it's Perseus and the Minotaur. It's the battle against and the defeat of the human thing that has become inhuman. The uncanny creature, the monster. And of course, I mean, visually, it's so powerful. I mean, Kubrick had such an ability to create iconic visuals, and to create visuals that can evoke whole ideas, can evoke whole concepts that are, without saying a word, in a kind of hieroglyphic way. And I think this labyrinth is absolutely the classic example of that. The Star Child in 2001 as well. And this the music here. I'm not sure who it is, what the music is here, but it's perfect, absolutely perfect. And as this goes on, I mean, Nicholson becomes more and more bestial to the point where he's just sort of shrieking incoherently. I mean, it's not even language by that time. What he's talking about. What he's saying is like it's reached the point where it's not even human speech. It's become something totally different. And Danny, of course, defeats him through intelligence by covering up his tracks and misguiding him. I can't remember what she sees here. It's either the blood or the skeletons. I also think like these scenes here are a little weak because they are, at least the skeletons in particular, it's a little too conventional sort of horror imagery for me. Oh, it's right. It's Halloran. The look on her face just becomes more and more potently deranged. But it is also kind of cool because what this sequence tells you is that, the hotel is having fun. You know what I mean? Like, it's all come out. Yeah, great party. You know, the hotel now, everything has been unleashed. All the horrors of the hotel are coming out, and it's the hotel now is enjoying itself. You know, it's like Mephistopheles finally going to war against heaven. It's like, you know, this is what it's all about. You know? And there is it is kind of cool in that sense, I have to say. You know. And the Steadicam obviously is completely essential to this, particularly when you're dealing with fake snow, where the camera would leave tracks, you know, and so the tracks of the camera would be very difficult to conceal. And yeah, this strikes me as being a little too much of a conventional haunted house image. Yeah, yeah, dead bodies. Although it's kind of creepy that there's one in the telephone booth, I have to say. No. Even masters aren't perfect. Even Kubrick, you know, made mistakes. You can't be 100% all the time. Although, if anyone tried, he certainly did. Yeah, it's the mind here that defeats the monster. And I think that was Kubrick. Ultimately, I think that was Kubrick's belief that, interestingly enough, as misanthropic as people think he was, I do think he believed in the way that Freud believed, and in the way that other thinkers of Freud's time believed, that the mind, ultimately reason, was what would allow mankind to triumph over his bestial instincts, even if it was only by understanding them and being aware of them and finding some way to make them work for good rather than evil, you know. But nonetheless, it is the triumph of the intellect over the instinctual and over the animal within us that redeems us and saves us. And of course, it's what saves Danny and his mother, and what ultimately defeats Nicholson, the monster, you know, basically. Yeah, this cue is great too. So in that sense, I don't think Kubrick is at all a misanthropic person, because he's sort of saying, well, it's in us. We have this capacity to redeem ourselves. And I think his more pessimistic films are more about why we haven't. You know what I mean? And I think what he was ambivalent about was whether intelligence ultimately would win. In other words, are our instincts towards violence and murder, is our bestial selves, like you're seeing here, is what Jack Nicholson here has become, is this too strong? Can this be resisted, you know, effectively by the mind, ultimately? And I think Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket, maybe even Barry Lyndon, are explorations of the failure of the intellect, of the triumph, if you like, of the instinctual violence that's within human beings, the brutality that we have within us, that we all have to one degree or another. And I think that, but 2001 and The Shining, well, Dr. Strangelove obviously also is a pessimistic film. I mean, they do ultimately blow up the world in spite of all their efforts, all their intellectual efforts, you know. But I think 2001 and particularly, and this film, and particularly Eyes Wide Shut, actually take an optimistic view in spite of all the sort of dark or disturbing imagery that they have. Because in each of those films, the characters, ultimately the good characters, if you like, the smart characters, the characters whose reason it has overcome, win out, I think, and do in some way redeem themselves. And I mean, in 2001, redeem the entirety of man, I suppose, and in this at least saves his own life, saves his mother's life, and in Eyes Wide Shut, you know, redeems his marriage, or they redeem their marriage and rediscover their desire for themselves, and rediscover their own sexuality, the sexuality between the two of them, you know, and the eroticism that still exists between the two of them. I think when he yells "Mommy" in this scene, I just don't get how people can say Kubrick is unemotional. I think it's very moving, this scene between the two of them. And here, this is the animal triumphant, the beast triumphant. Yeah, and I mean, she saves him and he saves her. I mean, there is a victory at the end of this film. You know, they do get away. They win. You know, compassion and intellect win out over bestiality and violence at the end of this film. It doesn't seem like an optimistic movie because it doesn't end on a sort of happy tone. You know, it ends in a very kind of ambiguous way. The house is still there. The house is still waiting. Which, of course, evil is always there. Evil's always waiting for its next chance. You know, the next big celebration, the next great party. You know, yeah, but here's, you know, you see, speech even has disappeared. The last vestige of humanity is gone. You know, the ability to even communicate. You know, it's almost primate what he's become now. And yeah, but I think ultimately there is an optimism to this film, and there's an optimism, especially to Eyes Wide Shut, which I think is represented, I think, a shift, and it's a shame he never got to follow up on a shift towards a more optimistic point of view in his films. And obviously it has something to do with the ambiguity of this ending, which people still make up all kinds of crazy stuff about, as in all things to do with this film, and about Kubrick himself, really. But there is a great cut here to the image of Jack frozen to death, covered with icicles. I think it's, again, I think it's kind of consciously a tease, to be fully honest. I'm not sure that Kubrick himself... There it is. It's brilliant. It really is a marvelous little stroke at the end, you know. And this, I love this shot, I really do, and I love this ending. And people talk endlessly about what it means. You know, I'm not sure Kubrick knew precisely, but I think what it means is his belief that evil will always be there, and that evil seeks to absorb and seeks to conquer us, you know, as it has now conquered and absorbed Jack. And perhaps he was always there, because evil is timeless and infinite, and has no exists beyond, in a way, the human realm, even though it exists in all human beings, you know. You know, and there he is, smiling away. Midnight, the stars, and you. This was actually airbrushed onto a vintage photograph. Jack Nicholson's head was airbrushed onto a vintage photograph. Very effective job, too, I think. Again, this song to me is just creepy. I don't know what it is. I think it's because it's so out of place in a horror film. You know, this kind of like 1920s happy dance number. You know, it just shouldn't be in a film like this. And that kind of, again, that uncanniness, that kind of dislocation. Yeah. I love it. I think it's a terrific ending. There was another ending afterwards that of Ullman visiting Danny and Wendy in a hospital after the whole thing has gone down, and it's apparently gone. Kubrick destroyed that as well. It was in, I think, even some of the original release prints, and then was cut out while the film was already playing, and left just on that final shot, which. No one will ever see it, so who knows, you know, but I think it is a great ending. Well, thank you very much for sitting through this, and it is a wonderful movie. I hope you enjoyed me listening, enjoyed me watching it, enjoyed listening to me babble on about it, and I thank you very much. Good night.